Bekaa Valley, Lebanon, June 9, 1982. 2:14 in the afternoon. The bunker smells like concrete dust and Bellamorcano cigarettes, the cheap Soviet kind with the cardboard filters that leave flakes on your tongue. Major Grigory Vetrov, military advisor, 4th Air Defense Brigade, seconded to the Syrian Arab Army, sits behind a P-12 spoon rest radar console and watches the sweep arm paint contacts across green phosphor. His tea has gone cold in a tin cup stamped with Cyrillic lettering that nobody here can read. He doesn't drink it. He is watching something he does not understand. The screen is wrong. There are too many contacts, dozens of them, coming in from the Mediterranean at attack speed, and they are everywhere, splitting, multiplying, filling the scope with returns that look like Shrike aircraft, but move like no Shrike aircraft he has ever tracked. The SA-6, battery 300 meters above his head, does what Soviet engineering designed it to do. The straight flush tracking radar goes active, locks onto the nearest return, and prepares to fire. Vetrov opens his mouth to say something. He will not finish the sentence because what he is seeing on that screen is not an Israeli Air Force. It is a ghost, a swarm of BQM-74 Chukar drones and ADM-141 decoys built by an American defense contractor in a suburb of Los Angeles. And every one of them is doing exactly what it was designed to do. Make a Soviet-trained radar operator believe he is under attack so that he turns on his tracking radar and reveals his position to the aircraft that are actually coming. The straight flush locks on. 7 seconds later, an AGM-45 Shrike anti-radiation missile, fired from an F-4E Phantom flying so low its belly paint is flecked with Lebanese cedar, rides the radar beam down like a train on a rail. The blast peels the antenna array open like a tin can. The scope in front of Vetrov goes white, then black. Then there is only dust, and the sound of a man screaming in Arabic somewhere above him, and a second explosion, and a third. He will survive. 19 Syrian air defense personnel in the batteries above him will not. What is happening across the Bekaa Valley in this hour is not a battle. It is a systems kill, the most lopsided destruction of an integrated air defense network since the Six-Day War 15 years earlier. In the next 120 minutes, the Israeli Air Force will destroy 17 of 19 Syrian SA-6 batteries, shoot down between 82 and 86 Syrian MiG-21 and MiG-23 fighters, and lose exactly 0 aircraft to enemy action. Not one. The technology that makes this possible is almost entirely American. The tactics are Israeli. The victims are Syrian. And the people who should be paying the closest attention, the generals and defense planners in Moscow who built every piece of equipment now burning in the valley below, will spend the next 3 years pretending it didn't happen the way it happened. This story matters because it is the moment the Soviet Union discovered its weapons didn't work. Not in theory. Not in a war game. In actual combat against a real Western-equipped enemy, with Soviet advisors standing right there watching it happen in real time. The lessons of the Bekaa Valley would reshape how every major military on Earth thinks about electronic warfare, suppression of enemy air defenses, and the integration of intelligence with strike operations. Most of those lessons are still classified. The men who learned them firsthand are dying of old age. If you think stories like this one deserve to stay on the record, then a like, a subscribe, and a comment telling me what military technology topic to cover next. That is how this channel keeps finding them before they disappear for good. Major Vetrov will write his after-action report in a Soviet embassy in Beirut 4 days from now. It will be honest. It will be detailed. It will be buried so deep in the Ministry of Defense archives that it might as well have been written in invisible ink. The men who needed to read it never did. Every aircraft that mattered over the Bekaa Valley rolled off an American assembly line. This fact tends to get lost in the retelling. The pilots were Israeli, and so were the planners who designed the strike package and the electronic warfare officers who wrote the jamming sequences. But the machines, the ones that turned a regional air force into the 4th most capable fighting force on the planet, came from Fort Worth, St. Louis, and Grumman's factory on Long Island. By the summer of 1982, the Israeli Air Force operated 74 F-15A Eagles and 67 F-16A Fighting Falcons. Neither type had been in Israeli service longer than 4 years. Both carried weapons that Soviet designers had never seen used in combat. And both existed because the United States Air Force had gotten its pilots killed in Vietnam and decided, with unusual institutional honesty, to figure out why. The F-15 came first. McDonnell Douglas delivered the initial airframes in 1976 under the Peace Fox program, and the Israelis gave it a name that translates roughly as buzzard, which tells you something about Israeli military culture. The aircraft itself needed no help from nomenclature. Empty weight, 28,000 pounds. Twin Pratt and Whitney F-100 turbofans producing a combined 48,000 pounds of thrust in afterburner. That is a thrust-to-weight ratio above 1.0 at combat loadout, meaning the Eagle can accelerate going straight up. No Soviet fighter in the Syrian inventory could match that number. The MiG-21 fishbed, the backbone of Assad's air force, produced 13,600 pounds of thrust from a single Tumansky R-25 engine and weighed 18,000 pounds loaded. Do the arithmetic. In a vertical fight, the MiG runs out of energy in about 40 seconds. The Eagle is just getting started. John Boyd would have appreciated the math. Colonel Boyd, fighter pilot, Pentagon bureaucrat, professional pain in the neck to every general officer who crossed his path, had spent the late 1960s developing what he called energy maneuverability theory. The core insight sounds obvious now. The fighter that gains and spends energy more efficiently wins. Boyd mapped every aircraft's performance across altitude, speed, and G-loading, then compared the envelopes. His charts proved what Vietnam had suggested. American fighters of that era, the F-4 Phantom in particular, bled energy in turns and couldn't sustain the kind of close-in maneuvering that MiG-17 and MiG-21 pilots forced on them. The F-15's design specification, written in 1969, reads like Boyd's revenge. Big wing, high thrust, low wing loading. A gun. The M61 Vulcan, 6 barrels, 6,000 rounds per minute. Because Boyd had watched what happened when you sent pilots into combat without one. The F-16 took Boyd's ideas further and made them cheaper. General Dynamics built it around a single F-100 engine, a fly-by-wire control system that let the airframe pull 9 Gs without the pilot having to fight the stick, and a bubble canopy that gave 360-degree visibility. Israeli F-16As weighed 15,200 pounds empty. Loaded for air combat with 2 AIM-9L Sidewinders and a full drum of 20 mm, the jet could sustain a 9G turn at 15,000 feet and Mach 0.85. Syrian MiG-23 flogger pilots needed to swing their variable geometry wings forward to turn hard, which dumped their speed below 300 knots. Below 300 knots, the flogger handles, according to one Soviet evaluation document, with reduced controllability in all axes. Reduced controllability. That is a polite way to describe an airplane trying to kill its own pilot. But the airframes were only half the advantage. The AIM-9L Sidewinder, delivered to Israel starting in 1981, carried an indium antimonide seeker cooled by argon gas that could track a target's infrared signature from any angle, front, side, above, below. Every previous Sidewinder variant required a tail chase. You had to get behind the enemy, point your nose at his exhaust, and hold it there long enough for the seeker to lock. The 9L eliminated that requirement. A pilot could fire head-on in a merge, crossing at a combined closure speed above 1,000 knots. Syrian pilots trained to defeat rear aspect missiles. They had never practiced against this, above all of it orbiting at 25,000 feet over the Mediterranean. An E-2C Hawkeye from the Israeli Navy tracked every Syrian aircraft from the moment its wheels left the runway at Dumair or Shrike or T4. The Hawkeye's AN/APS-125 radar could hold 300 contacts simultaneously and data link target vectors directly to the fighters. Israeli F-15 pilots knew where the MiGs were before the MiGs knew they were being hunted. 6 hours of fuel in the Hawkeye's tanks, 12 Sparrows and 8 Sidewinders across a 4-ship of Eagles, 67 Falcons loaded and taxiing at Ramat David. The clock read 10 a.m., Dumair Air Base, 50 kilometers northeast of Damascus. The flight line shimmers in June heat, jet exhaust mixing with desert thermals, until the MiG-21s parked along the taxiway look like they're melting at the edges. Captain Walid Hamdan, composite name, because Syrian Air Force personnel records from this period are either classified or destroyed, climbs into a fishbed N variant and straps the ejection seat harness across his chest. His orders come not from his squadron commander, but from a ground control intercept station 14 kilometers south, staffed by a Syrian officer and a Soviet advisor, whose name does not appear in any document available to Western researchers. The GCI controller will tell Hamdan when to turn, when to climb, when to arm his weapons, and when to fire. Hamdan's job is to comply. This is Soviet air defense doctrine in its purest form. The pilot is a component. The brain sits on the ground. Moscow had spent 11 years and an estimated $4 billion building Syria's integrated air defense network into the densest outside the Warsaw Pact. The Bekaa Valley alone held 19 SA-6 Gainful batteries arranged in overlapping engagement zones, each battery consisting of a straight flush fire control radar, 4 triple-rail transporter erector launchers, and a long-track early warning radar feeding target data to the brigade command post. The SA-6 missile itself carried a 56-kilogram fragmentation warhead to a maximum range of 24 kilometers and could engage targets as low as 30 meters above ground level. At medium altitude, say 15,000 feet, where a Shrike aircraft might release bombs, the system's probability of kill against a non-maneuvering target ran between 70 and 85%. Soviet technical literature used the phrase guaranteed engagement zone. That word, guaranteed, showed up in the sales brochures Damascus received and in the training manuals the advisors carried. It showed up in the briefings Syrian generals gave to Hafez al-Assad himself. Backing the SA-6 batteries sat older but still lethal SA-2 guideline and SA-3 GOA systems covering medium and high altitude. Below them, at the point defense level, ZSU-23-4, Shilka self-propelled anti-aircraft guns laid down curtains of 23mm fire at a combined rate of 3,400 rounds per minute per vehicle. The Shilka's gun dish radar could acquire a fast-moving target at 8 kilometers and track it automatically, while all 4 barrels converged on a single point in space. An aircraft flying through a Shilka engagement zone at low altitude, the kind of low altitude you need to avoid the SA-6, had roughly 4 seconds of exposure time. In 4 seconds, a Shilka puts 227 rounds into the air. The diesel generators powering the radar vans hummed day and night, a low vibration you could feel through the soles of your boots standing 50 meters away. The smell hung in the valley. Exhaust fumes and ozone from high-voltage radar transmitters mixing with the dry grass of the Lebanese summer. Soviet advisors rotated through on 6-month tours, living in prefabricated housing units behind the command bunkers, eating canned rations shipped from Odessa. They filed weekly readiness reports to the main operations directorate in Moscow. Those reports, or the fragments that have surfaced since 1991, consistently rated the Bekaa network as combat-ready, with high confidence in system integration. High confidence. The phrase recurs across multiple documents. Here is what high confidence looked like in practice. Syrian radar operators trained on a fixed schedule, 4 hours daily, 6 days a week, running simulated intercepts against cooperative targets, flying predictable profiles. They practiced acquiring aircraft that flew straight, at known altitudes, at briefed times. Nobody trained them against targets that multiplied on their screens, or for scenarios where the jamming environment changed every 90 seconds. They had never seen a Shrike missile and did not know what one looked like on a radar warning receiver, because their radar warning receivers were Soviet-made SPO-10 Sirena sets designed to detect American radars from the Vietnam era. The Shrike's seeker operated on frequencies the Sirena couldn't see. 11 hours remained before the first drone crossed the Lebanese coastline. Every radar in the valley sat fat and warm and broadcasting. 2 p.m., the drones are already dying. Mastiff and Scout, UAVs, Israeli-built, not American, and this matters, crossed the ridgeline at 800 feet above the valley floor, engines buzzing like lawnmowers at a frequency that returns on radar as something much larger than a 12-foot drone with a pusher propeller. The first straight flush locks on at 14:07. The second follows 9 seconds later. Within 90 seconds, 11 of 19 SA-6 batteries have gone active. Their tracking radars painting the sky with energy that the E-2C Hawkeye circling 40 miles west drinks in like water. Frequency, pulse repetition interval, side lobe characteristics, position to within 25 meters. Every parameter the Shrike and standard ARM need to find their way home. The SA-6 crews do not hesitate. They fire. Missiles leap off their rails trailing white smoke, accelerating to Mach 2.8 in 4 seconds, chasing targets that cost $11,000 apiece. An SA-6 missile costs roughly $200,000. The exchange rate favors the drones. Syrian battery commanders realize something is wrong within about 3 minutes. The targets are too slow, too small, and there are too many of them. Standard intercept doctrine calls for ceasefire and reassessment. But the GCI stations are screaming orders, the radars are still active, and nobody in the chain of command has the authority or the nerve to shut down without permission from Damascus. Permission requires a phone call to the Ministry of Defense, which requires reaching a deputy minister, which on a Wednesday afternoon in June requires knowing which office he is sitting in. The bureaucratic delay lasts approximately 8 minutes. 8 minutes is a lifetime. At 14:15, the first wave of F-4E Phantoms crosses the Lebanese coast at 200 feet, terrain masking behind the ridges west of the valley. Each aircraft carries 2 AGM-78 standard anti-radiation missiles, heavier and longer range than the Shrike, with a memory circuit that keeps tracking even if the target radar shuts down. Behind them, Kafir C-2s carry AGM-45 Shrikes. Older, cheaper, no memory, but at this range, it hardly matters. The radars are screaming. The missiles know where to go. The first standard ARM hits Battery 6 at 14:17. The warhead, 215 pounds of high explosive, detonates 3 meters above the straight flush antenna, shredding the waveguide assembly and killing 2 operators in the radar van. Battery 9 goes dark 4 seconds later. Battery 12. Battery 3. Battery 15. The strikes roll south to north across the valley in a pattern so precisely timed that one Israeli pilot later described it as a zipper closing. The Mastiff drone, the thing that made all of this possible, almost never got built. Tadiran Electronics developed it on a shoestring budget after the Israeli Air Force lost 30 aircraft to SAMs during the 1973 Yom Kippur War. The original program cost ran to something like $40 million. The Pentagon, at the same time, had spent over $1 billion on the Aquila drone program, which produced exactly 0 operational units before cancellation. 40 million versus $1 billion. Same requirement, same decade, opposite results. This irritates me more than it should. Back to the valley. By 14:25, 11 minutes after the first straight flush went active, 17 of 19 SA-6 batteries have been destroyed or knocked offline. The surviving 2 shut down their radars voluntarily, which renders them operationally useless. The integrated air defense network that Moscow spent $4 billion and 11 years constructing ceases to function as a coherent system. The overlapping engagement zones collapse. The guaranteed kill zones evaporate. Syrian fighters scrambling from Dumair and Shayrat will fly into airspace that their own side can no longer protect. The Hawkeye tracks them from the moment their wheels leave concrete. Ground controllers at the surviving GCI stations attempt to vector MiG-21s and MiG-23s toward the Israeli strike aircraft. But the jamming environment has become impenetrable. Israeli EL/L-8202 noise jammers, mounted on specially configured Boeing 707 aircraft orbiting over the Mediterranean, saturate the frequencies Syrian GCI uses to communicate with its pilots. Controllers transmit bearing and altitude calls, pilots hear static. Some MiG pilots, unable to receive ground vectors, default to their training and begin searching visually. At 15,000 feet, scanning a sky full of chaff clouds and jamming strobes, looking for aircraft painted in desert camouflage against a desert background. They will not find the F-15s before the F-15s find them. 46 Syrian fighters are airborne. The Eagles are already turning toward the merge. Sparrow missiles armed. Radar in track while scan. Closure rate, 1,200 knots. Time to weapons release, 90 seconds. The first Sparrow leaves the rail with a sound like a door slamming in a cathedral. A sharp concussive bang followed by the hiss of solid rocket motor igniting. Then a white smoke trail drawing a line across blue sky toward a target the pilot cannot see with his own eyes. The APG-63 radar sees it fine. Range, 22 nautical miles. The MiG-23 is still climbing through 12,000 feet when the missile arrives. Splash 1. The voice on the radio sounds bored. That recording, declassified fragments of Israeli Air Force combat communications from June 9th, carries a quality that borders on surreal. The Israeli pilots speak in clipped, measured cadences, short transmissions, acknowledging target assignments from the Hawkeye controller the way a taxi dispatcher assigns fares. Meanwhile, the Syrian GCI frequencies, monitored in real time by Israeli electronic intelligence aircraft, are a wall of noise. Multiple controllers transmitting simultaneously. Pilots requesting vectors and receiving nothing. One fragment, widely cited in post-war analyses, captures a Syrian pilot asking for his controller 3 times in 11 seconds. No response comes. He had nobody to talk to. The jamming had seen to that. The F-15s worked in pairs, stacked at different altitudes, the high element engaging with AIM-7F Sparrows at beyond visual range, while the low element cleaned up survivors with AIM-9Ls. The geometry favored the Israelis so completely that several engagements ended before the Syrian pilots knew they had begun. A Sparrow traveling at Mach 4 covers 22 miles in roughly 50 seconds. A MiG-23's SPO-10 radar warning receiver detects the APG-63's tracking beam at approximately 15 miles. That leaves the Syrian pilot 30 seconds to identify the threat and break lock. 30 seconds, assuming his warning receiver functions correctly in an environment saturated with Israeli jamming. Most did not function correctly. The MiG-25 Foxbats arrived from Tias Air Base around 15:30, the heaviest response Damascus could muster. 37,000 pounds of interceptor built to chase American B-70 Valkyrie bombers that never entered production. Blazing speed in a straight line, Mach 2.8 at altitude. Turning ability of a freight train. The Foxbat carried 4 R-40 radar-guided missiles designed to kill bombers at long range, not dogfight with agile fighters in a dense electronic warfare environment. Israeli F-15 pilots engaged them head-on with Sparrows, and the Foxbat crews discovered that their RP-25 Smerch radar could not burn through the jamming to establish a lock. They fired anyway. The R-40s went ballistic, guiding on nothing. By 1600 hours, 29 Syrian aircraft had fallen. Sources conflict on the exact breakdown. Some counts credit 23 to the F-15 and 6 to the F-16. Others distribute the kills differently. The Israeli Air Force lost 0 aircraft in air-to-air combat. 0. Not a single airframe touched. Frame. A maintenance crew at Ramat David refueled and rearmed an F-15 in 14 minutes. The pilot taxied back to the runway, eating a sandwich someone had handed through the canopy rail. Dawn would bring more MiGs. The Israelis had plenty of missiles. 82 confirmed. 85 probable. 86 claimed. The number depends on which debrief you read and whether you count the MiG-21 that crashed on approach to Demayr. Lost to combat stress? Mechanical failure? The file doesn't say. Pick any figure in that range, and the conclusion stays identical. Over 3 days of fighting, the Syrian Arab Air Force fed squadron after squadron into the Bekaa Valley and got nothing back but wreckage. June 10th opened with a 12-ship formation of MiG-23s launching from Shrike at 0645. The Hawkeye picked them up, climbing through 8,000 feet, 60 miles out. F-15s from the overnight combat air patrol rolled in before the floggers reached the valley. 7 fell in under 4 minutes. The remaining 5 turned for home. 2 made it. On the Israeli flight line at Ramat David, the smell of avgas pooled in the morning heat, sweet and sharp, mixing with the petroleum stink of aeroshell hydraulic fluid leaking from quick disconnect fittings that ground crews hadn't had time to properly torque. They worked in shifts now, 12 hours on, 12 off, painting small silhouettes below cockpit rails on fuselages still ticking as engine casings contracted in the cooler air. One F-15 carried 7 marks by the afternoon of June 10th. Its pilot had flown 4 sorties in 26 hours. Damascus kept launching. This demands explanation because by any rational calculus the air campaign had failed before lunch on June 9th. The SAM network lay in pieces. The jamming environment remained impenetrable. Every tactical advantage pointed one direction. Assad's generals knew the losses. Syrian radar stations could track their own aircraft disappearing from scope, and they kept writing scramble orders anyway. 3 reasons, none of them military. First, the Ba'athist command structure punished hesitation more severely than failure. A general who stopped fighting risked a visit from Air Force intelligence, which in Assad's Syria meant imprisonment or worse. Losing planes killed pilots. Refusing to fly killed careers and families. Second, Soviet advisors at the Ministry of Defense maintained, reportedly with considerable insistence, that the equipment performed within design parameters and that the fault lay with Syrian execution. Adjust tactics, increase sortie rates, press the attack. The phrase operator error appears in a Soviet advisory cable dated June 10th. 82 aircraft down, and the diagnosis pointed at the men, not the machines. Third, Assad himself viewed the air battle through a political lens that had nothing to do with exchange ratios. Continued resistance, even catastrophic resistance, preserved Syria's position within the Arab confrontation states. Surrender in the air meant surrender at the negotiating table. Dead pilots cost less than lost leverage. So, they flew. MiG-21s armed with R-3S missiles, infrared seekers with a detection range of roughly 4 kilometers against a tail aspect target, against F-15s carrying AIM-7s that reached out to 40. The engagement envelopes didn't overlap. Syrian pilots entered weapons range of the Eagle approximately never. When they got close enough to see their opponents, it meant a Sidewinder had already seen them. The heat signature of a Tomansky R-25 turbojet in full afterburner lit up the AIM-9L's cooled indium antimonide seeker from 6 kilometers away. Bright as a bonfire on a dark night. By sunset on June 11th, the ceasefire took hold. Israeli Air Force losses in air-to-air combat across all 3 days stood at 0. The ground crews at Ramat David ran out of room below 1 cockpit rail and started a second row. Colonel General Yevgeny Yuvashev drafted the first cable from Damascus before the ceasefire ink dried. The transmission reached the General Staff Main Operations Directorate at 11 p.m. Moscow time on June 11th. 47 pages. Attachments including radar performance logs, engagement timelines, pilot debriefs conducted through translators who struggled with the Syrian dialect. The cover summary used a word that translates loosely as systemic incompatibility. The operations desk officer who received it called his superior at home. His superior called the deputy chief of the general staff. By morning, 3 copies sat on 3 desks. Nobody wanted to sign the routing slip. The problem extended well beyond Syria. Every SA-6 battery deployed along the inner German border, 412 launchers spread across East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Poland, operated on identical doctrine. The straight flush radar was the same across all of them, running the same engagement sequence on the assumption that NATO electronic countermeasures could be managed through frequency agility and sector scanning. The Bekaa Valley proved that assumption wrong in 11 minutes. A small air force with American jammers, American anti-radiation missiles, and cheap Israeli drones had turned a $4 billion air defense network into scrap metal before the operators finished their second cigarette. NATO fielded jammers 2 generations ahead of anything the Israelis carried. Their anti-radiation missiles, the AGM-88 HARM, entering production that same year, made the standard arm look primitive. If the Israelis could do this with export-grade American technology, what could the Americans do with the real thing? Marshal Nikolai Ogarkov read the Damascus cable and reached a conclusion that would cost him his career. The report uses the phrase qualitative disparity in command and control responsiveness, a Soviet euphemism so dense it practically collapses under its own weight. Strip away the jargon, and Ogarkov argued something dangerous. Soviet military doctrine had fallen a generation behind Western capability, and closing the gap required not better versions of existing weapons, but an entirely different approach to warfare. Precision strike, real-time intelligence fusion, automated command networks that removed the human bottleneck, the deputy minister unreachable on a Wednesday afternoon from the kill chain. He called it the revolution in military affairs. The Politburo called it expensive. Ogarkov pressed the argument through 1983 and into 1984. He gave interviews, he published. He told a visiting American delegation, with what one attendee described as visible frustration, that Soviet force structure prioritized mass over precision at a ratio that no longer made strategic sense. Defense Minister Ustinov, whose industrial patronage networks depended on producing large quantities of existing platforms, viewed this as a direct attack. In September 1984, Ogarkov lost his position as Chief of the General Staff. Reassigned to command the Western Theater, a posting that carried prestige but no policy influence. The SA-6 batteries along the inner German border kept their original software loads through 1989. The upgrades Ogarkov requested never arrived. When the wall came down, NATO intelligence teams inspecting Warsaw Pact air defense sites in eastern Germany found straight-flush radars running firmware dated 1976. John Boyd slammed a 90-page brief on the desk of Air Force Secretary Vern Orr 3 weeks after the ceasefire. The title read, Energy Maneuverability Validation, Bekaa Valley Engagements, Preliminary Assessment. Boyd had retired from the Air Force 6 years earlier. Nobody had asked him for the brief. He delivered it anyway. The F-15, his airplane, the one he'd fought the Pentagon bureaucracy for a decade to build, had killed MiGs over Lebanon with the exact flight profile his energy maneuverability theory predicted. High thrust-to-weight ratio plus low wing loading equals sustained turn capability at combat speeds. The Pratt & Whitney F-100 engine producing 23,800 pounds of thrust in afterburner, pushing a combat-loaded airframe weighing roughly 26,000 pounds, nearly 1-to-1. A flogger pilot pulling into a turning fight against that ratio entered a declining energy state within the first 360 degrees of turn. By the second full circle, he flew too slow to maneuver and too committed to disengage. The Sidewinder did the rest. Boyd's brief sat unread for 2 months. The conclusions didn't need his help. They'd already reached every program office in the building through official channels. The AIM-9L changed something fundamental about how fighter pilots thought about geometry. Previous Sidewinder variants required a tail aspect shot. You had to get behind your target, center the exhaust plume in your seeker's field of view, wait for tone. The Lima model's cooled indium antimonad detector acquired targets from any angle. Head-on, beam, quartering, high deflection. A Syrian pilot flying toward an F-16 faced a missile that could kill him from the front. The traditional merge, 2 fighters passing head-on, each trying to reverse into the other's 6 o'clock, lost its symmetry overnight. The American pilot didn't need to complete the turn. He needed about 4 seconds of stable tracking. The engagement compressed from minutes of maneuvering to a single pass. 1,400 miles west of the Bekaa Valley, at the Grumman plant on Long Island, E-2C production received a funding increase of 31% for fiscal year 1983. The Hawkeye had done something over Lebanon that no briefing slide could adequately capture. It had made Israeli pilots omniscient. Every Syrian launch detected, tracked, assigned to a responding fighter. The Hawkeye controller saw the entire chessboard. Syrian GCY operators saw fragments through a fog of jamming. That asymmetry mattered more than any airframe specification or missile range figure. An F-15, with perfect information fighting a MiG-23 with none, isn't a contest. It's an execution. The Pentagon's annual report to Congress in February 1983 devoted 11 pages to what it called the demonstrated effectiveness of integrated Western air combat systems. 11 pages in a document notorious for saying nothing at length that qualifies as enthusiasm. Every major program under scrutiny received a reprieve. The F-15 production line at McDonnell Douglas in St. Louis stayed open. F-16 orders from NATO allies accelerated. HARM missile procurement doubled. The argument that American weapons cost too much, that simpler Soviet designs offered better value through sheer numbers, collapsed against a single data point, 86-0. One detail from the congressional testimony sticks with me for reasons I can't fully articulate. General Wilbur Creech, commander of Tactical Air Command, presented a chart showing cost per kill for the Bekaa Valley engagements. An AIM-9L cost roughly $42,000 in 1982. A MiG-23 cost $11 million. He let the math sit for 6 seconds before moving to the next slide. February 26, 1991, 2:17 a.m. local time. An F-15E Strike Eagle, designated Chevrolet 03, released 2 GBU-10 Paveway 2s on a convoy of Iraqi Republican Guard vehicles retreating north along Highway 80 out of Kuwait City. Both bombs struck within 4 meters of their laser designation points. The convoy burned for 9 hours, coalition aircraft stacked in holding patterns, waiting their turn to drop. Pilots called it the Highway of Death, the Bekaa Valley's promise, delivered at industrial scale. We could see everything, hit everything, and nothing they did mattered. Colonel David Deptula, one of the architects of the Desert Storm air campaign, used that sentence in a post-war debrief at Checkmate, the Air Staff's strategic planning cell in the Pentagon basement. He meant it as assessment, not boast. The Iraqi air defense network, denser than the Bekaa Valleys, more layered, better funded, collapsed in the first 72 hours. F-4G. Wild weasels firing HARM missiles blinded the radars. F-117 stealth fighters hit command bundles that Iraqi generals assumed sat beyond reach. E-3 OWACS aircraft managed an air picture spanning 400,000 square miles of desert in real time. 42 days of air operations destroyed an army of 540,000 men as a functioning military force before a single American tank crossed the berm. The exchange rate looked familiar. 33 Iraqi aircraft shot down in air-to-air combat. American losses to enemy fighters, 0. The Bekaa Valley ratio held perfectly, scaled up by a factor of 10, against an enemy with a decade to study what happened to Syria and prepare countermeasures. Iraq spent $8 billion on air defenses between 1982 and 1990. That money purchased a longer version of the same result. The confidence this bred ran deep. Deeper than doctrine, deeper than procurement cycles, deeper than any single commander's career. It settled into the institutional bones of the American military establishment like calcium deposits. Technology identified, struck, and won. The proof filled hangars at Wright-Patterson, where intelligence teams cataloged, captured Iraqi equipment. Every shattered T-72 and gutted BMP a data point confirming what the Bekaa Valley first demonstrated. American sensors found targets and American weapons killed them. The sequence operated with something approaching mechanical certainty. 20 months after the victory parade down Constitution Avenue, a Black Hawk helicopter descended into a dense urban neighborhood in southern Mogadishu. October 3, 1993. Task Force Ranger had the best sensors, the best communications, the best trained operators, the best medevac capability the special operations community could field. They also had a target, 2 lieutenants of warlord Mohammed Farah Aidid meeting in the Olympic Hotel near the Bukhara market. The snatch went according to plan. The extraction did not. Somali militia fighters, no radar network, no integrated air defense, no armored vehicles, nothing that looked like a target the Bekaa Valley doctrine recognized. Shot down 2 Black Hawks with RPG-7s. rocket-propelled grenades designed in 1961. The ensuing fight killed 18 Americans and somewhere between 300 and 1,500 Somalis. Sources conflict on the Somali figure badly. The technology worked exactly as designed. Night vision cut through darkness. Miniguns shredded technicals. Little birds put rounds on target with surgical accuracy. None of it mattered against an enemy who fought from alleyways and rooftops, who mixed with civilians, who presented no electronic signature to detect and no formation to disrupt. The kill chain, sensor to shooter to target, assumed a target that behaved like a military asset. IDID's militia behaved like a city. A decade later, the pattern repeated at continental scale. The initial invasion of Iraq in March 2003 destroyed Saddam Hussein's conventional forces with a speed that would have seemed fantastical to planners in 1982. 3 weeks from the Kuwaiti border to Baghdad. The thunder runs through the capital on April 5th and 7th shattered the Republican Guard's will to fight as an organized force. Every lesson from the Bekaa Valley confirmed, again louder. Then the statue fell and the targets disappeared. IEDs buried in trash piles along Route Irish carried no radar signature. A sniper in Ramadi firing from a bedroom window occupied no grid square that a JDAM could service without leveling the block. The F-15s sat on the ramp at Balad, loaded and ready, waiting for a war that looked like the one they trained for. Creech's cost per kill chart assumed the enemy arrived in something worth $11 million. In Fallujah, the enemy arrived in a sedan worth $800. Somewhere in the Frunze Military Academy Library in 1985, a captain named Mahmoud Garib pulled Ogarkov's dismissed proposals off the restricted shelf and began writing a book. The manuscript took 6 years. It argued that the next major war would be decided in the first hours by whoever controlled the electromagnetic spectrum and delivered precision fires fastest. Soviet reviewers rejected it twice. Garib published in 1991, the same year the country that rejected him ceased to exist. The Soviet Union died still arguing about whether Ogarkov had a point. The Russians, who inherited the wreckage, stopped arguing. We studied the Bekaa Valley the way a medical student studies a cadaver, not to mourn it, but to understand what killed it. That line appears in a 2006 interview with Colonel General Anatoly Nogovitsyn, Deputy Chief of the Russian General Staff, published in Voyenno-Promyshlenie Courier. He meant the Syrian air defense network specifically, but the metaphor stretched further than he probably intended. The cadaver kept teaching lessons for 25 years. Russian military reformers dissected every engagement, every jammed radar, every drone that drew fire from a real missile battery. They built a curriculum around defeat. The Georgian War in August 2008 looked nothing like the Bekaa Valley on the surface. Russian ground forces crossed the Rukki Tunnel into South Ossetia, with T-72s and BMP-2s fighting a 5-day land campaign against an army smaller than a single American division. Messy, poorly coordinated, plagued by friendly fire and communications failures that embarrassed the general staff badly enough to trigger the most sweeping military reform since the Second World War. But buried in the after-action reports, fragments of which leaked through Russian defense journalists over the following 18 months, sat something familiar. Russian electronic warfare units jammed Georgian military communications across the entire theater within the first 4 hours. Georgian radar-guided air defenses went blind. Russian Su-25s operated over the battlefield with near impunity not because Georgian defenses lacked capability, but because those defenses couldn't talk to each other. The kill chain broke at the same link the Israelis had severed in 1982. The Russians had practiced this specific sequence. 6 years later, eastern Ukraine. No tanks crossed a border. No aircraft dropped bombs, at least none wearing Russian markings. Instead, the electromagnetic spectrum over Donetsk and Luhansk turned opaque. Ukrainian military units reported GPS denial across frontages 30 kilometers wide. Secure radio nets collapsed under jamming so precise it targeted individual command frequencies while leaving civilian bands untouched. Ukrainian commanders reverted to cell phones. Russian signals intelligence collected those calls in real time. Artillery corrections followed within minutes. The Ukrainians called the Russian electronic warfare units the Invisible Hand. They killed without appearing on any satellite photograph or CNN broadcast. Ogarkov's revolution, 30 years late. Wearing civilian clothes. Where you stand determines what the irony looks like. The Americans won the Bekaa Valley so completely that the victory fossilized into assumption, air superiority as birthright, technological overmatch as permanent condition. The Soviets lost it so completely that a generation of military thinkers rebuilt their entire theory of warfare around ensuring it never happened again. The losers studied, the winners celebrated. Both responses feel rational in the moment. One of them ages badly. The SA-6 batteries are gone from the Bekaa Valley now. The revetments filled with rainwater and trash decades ago. Lebanese farmers grow cannabis in fields where Syrian radar operators once chain-smoked and watched their screens paint false returns they couldn't distinguish from real ones. The bunker at Daidet Yabus, where the senior Syrian air defense commander lost contact with 17 of 19 batteries in 11 minutes. That structure still stands, reportedly. Concrete and rebar endure longer than the doctrines they sheltered. 86 aircraft, 0 losses. The scoreboard stands permanently, perfectly, unarguably in America's favor. The technology worked. The tactics worked. The integration of sensors, weapons, electronic warfare, and command and control worked with a precision that still defines how the United States Air Force thinks about the opening hours of a major conflict. What the scoreboard doesn't capture is simpler and harder to quantify. The side that got destroyed spent 40 years trying to understand why. The side that destroyed them spent 40 years assuming they already knew. The tea in the bunker at Jedidet Yabus went cold sometime around 3:15 p.m., local time on June 9, 1982. The diesel generators feeding the P-18 radar had already gone silent. Whether from a harm strike or a manual shutdown, the records don't say. The Soviet technical advisor assigned to that position, a signals officer whose name appears only as Lieutenant Colonel, VK in a partially declassified GRU personnel rotation log from 1983, filed no after-action report. His next documented assignment placed him at the Zhukovsky Air Force Engineering Academy 14 months later, teaching electronic countermeasures to cadets. The curriculum he developed reportedly opened with a single question. What does the enemy see when he looks at you? 37,000 feet above the valley floor, the E-2C Hawkeye from Squadron 114 maintained its racetrack orbit. The AN/APS-1-38 radar dome turned at 6 revolutions per minute, painting a circle 250 nautical miles in diameter. The scope glowed green, that particular shade of phosphor green, unique to cathode ray tubes running P1 persistence, a color that fades in about 1.6 seconds if nothing refreshes it. By 4 p.m., nothing refreshed it. The Syrian Air Force had stopped launching. The last MiG-23 to cross the Lebanese border turned back over the anti-Lebanon mountains at 3:47 p.m. without engaging. The Hawkeye's Combat Information Center crew tracked it until it descended below radar coverage near Demire. Then the scope swept clean. Green light, empty air. The operators kept watching anyway. Negative contact all sectors. Scope is clean. The transmission appears in Israeli Air Force communications logs, time stamped 1552 local. A Hawkeye controller reporting to Northern Command that there remained nothing left to fight. The acknowledgement from the ground station took 4 seconds. Someone at Northern Command of the log identifies the position as Senior Fighter Controller Station Birch. Responded with a single word. Confirmed. Down in the valley, smoke still rose from 17 SA-6 positions. The acrid stink of burning rubber and propellant hung in thermals that carried it west toward Beirut, mixing with the smell of turned earth where bomb craters exposed wet clay beneath the topsoil. Shattered fan-song antenna arrays pointed at odd angles, their parabolic dishes crumpled into shapes that looked almost organic, like enormous aluminum flowers wilting in the heat. At one site near Zhubjanin, A straight flush radar van sat with its cabin door open and its crew gone. A half-eaten plate of bread and labna rested on the operator's console next to the display. The phosphor on that screen had faded too. The Israeli Air Force's official tally closed at 86 aircraft destroyed for 0 air-to-air losses. 17 of 19 SA-6 batteries neutralized. The engagement lasted roughly 2 hours from first drone launch to final missile impact. American-built aircraft carrying American-built missiles, guided by American-built radar, supported by American-built electronic warfare, all of it performing at or above specification against the Soviet Union's frontline export systems. The variables were controlled, the outcomes measurable. The kind of war a spreadsheet can love. The E-2C landed at Mazor Airfield at 6:22 p.m. Ground crew chalked the wheels and connected external power. The radar dome stopped turning. Inside the aircraft, the mission tapes, 14 spools of magnetic recording containing every radar track, every radio transmission, every intercept vector issued during the engagement, went into a locked transit case. Israeli intelligence cataloged them as Operation Mole Cricket 19. Master reference file, tapes 1 through 14. The after-action report, when it reached the Pentagon 3 weeks later through liaison channels, carried a classification stamp of top secret/Umbra and a distribution list of 11 names. Page 47 contained a single-line entry that read, "Recommend further study of integrated air defense suppression methodology for application to Central European theater." Below it, a handwritten annotation in blue ink, initials illegible. "If this works against the Soviets the way it worked against their..." The sentence stops there. The rest of the page is redacted.